Hey guys. So, I've been told I have to tell you about Conquest and the world we've made. So, my idea was to walk you through the factions in chronological and story order so that you understand the context and the relations between them. So, I'm going to start with the baseline faction, the Hundred Kingdoms. They, uh, they are your generic humans, right? That sounds both cool and very, very boring to some people. The idea around them was always these are the guys with swords fighting against the unfathomable spaceborne slash horror-born monstrosities around the world. It's the point of view, the window from which you view the world, let's say. And much of the work that we've done is based on as much historicity and historical accounts and events as we could. So the Hundred Kingdoms is a early medieval society. So we're talking somewhere between a historical equivalent on Earth would have been 1100 to 1300s, and they are a fragmented group of countries that were once united under one empire. The last emperor was killed, and unable to come to terms and elect a new emperor, they sort of have fallen into a fractious disunity, mimicking largely that of the Holy Roman Empire in European history. There are countless self-styled kings, barons, dukes, princes, all sorts of titles. That's why we ended up calling them the Hundred Kingdoms. There might be more, there might be less. They come and go with alarming regularity. But the idea is that you have a broadly European society that has been developing at roughly the same pace. One of the interesting bits of the story is that we've wanted to echo and mimic a lot of the history that we're familiar with. So you will hear a lot of historians talk about like how seminal the fall of the Roman Empire was. And in our world, we have created a relatively similar event titled The Fall. We're very creative. Um, and it is essentially the moment that mankind destroyed its patron god, and so destroyed the sort of continent spanning theocracy that used to dominate the world. And everything that comes after is after the fall, much like Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, although I think that is outdated today by today's standards. After the fall of the Roman Empire, this follows a similar trajectory. So the Hundred Kingdoms is a faction that is centered around combined arms. So you're going to have your knights, you're going to have your powerful professional infantry, you're going to have your fanatical religious troops, and then you're going to have your exceptional quality in what we call the orders. Now, the interesting thing is the orders and the church are actually very separate. They originate from very, very different origins, and they do not play well together. The orders are by and large, while deeply spiritual, they are not religious, and do not hold well to the concept of a church and gods. They are more about ideologies than they are about strict religious systems. And then when it comes to the, let's call it the more mainline troops, the more traditional troops, you are going to find them divided into two groups. You're going to have the feudal troops, right? These are the ones that follow the feudal society established by the empire that came before, the Telian Empire, and they are largely what you would expect: feudal obligations, peasants, knights, kings, depending on the local nobility, to raise levies. And then you have what we call the imperial remnants. And the imperial remnants are when the Telian Empire fell a few hundred years ago, the apparatus of state that they had built, some of it has managed to survive under the protection of the Chamberlain and the support of some of the military orders it had created. They hold a weird position in that they are the custodians of the imperial legacy without an actual emperor. And the Chamberlain is a very central figure in the politics of the Hundred Kingdoms, but whatever power he has, he can truly only use it to protect what were once imperial properties and imperial institutions. But the nobility and the church are continuously encroaching on it. So, for example, imperial forests that slowly come under the purview of local nobles, or the right for the highways and the taxation of the highways. So it creates this sort of tense dynamic between the more feudal aristocratic houses, the imperial and the imperial loyal houses. You have the orders who were staunchly pro-imperial because they supported and were supported by the Telian Empire. And additionally, you have the church, which has strongly supported the rise of the feudal faction. So you start seeing the complex politics of the Hundred Kingdoms, and it plays out in their army special rules where they're allowed to have two warlords, right? And these warlords together work synergistically to bring about the best you can from your mercenary troops, your feudal troops, and then your order troops or your religious troops, because it's very difficult for orders and imperial and the church to sort of share command of an army. So the quintessential enemy of the Hundred Kingdoms and the second faction historically that we put out are what we call the spires. So imagine, if you will, you're walking across a medieval landscape. You see your dotted by little villages and rivers and forests. And in the distance, you see this strange organic structure that rises 2-3 kilometers into the air. It's got a circumference of half a kilometer. It's this titanic, pale structure that as you approach, you realize it's not built, but rather grown from the ground itself. And these are the spires where the exiles live. The exiles are our take on Tolkien's elves. Much like Tolkien said that the elves were the children of the stars, in our case, the spires are not native to the world. They originally came long before mankind as refugees from their own world, fleeing an unknown enemy, and established their presence on the world when AI itself was young. They are old, they are very advanced, and they are blessed with very strange gifts that mankind does not share. So in the beginning, they were very different to the spires that you know today. In the beginning, it was a single unified group who possessed the gift of life binding, the ability to connect to other living entities and share and absorb their qualities. And this was a highly ritualized act in which entire families would bind to specific animals, beasts, and environments, and plants even of any given environment. Now, when the cataclysm that forced them to come to Ea happened, it sent fractures down the structure of society. The sovereign, the highest rank individual to be able to flee along with what population was able to be saved, took the decision to close the ways that they used to arrive on this planet and sealed off the vast majority of the fleeing population on their home planet. Now, he claims he did it to prevent the enemy from coming and following the exiles here, but a lot of his followers believed he did it to be able to retain absolute powers, and that created the sort of the basis for the fracture. So when they arrived, on this planet, there was nothing. It was primordial. And it had some fascinating beasts on it, which it took them not very long to realize that those beasts were not quite beasts and were in fact intelligent. And what we're talking about is the dragons. I'm not going to launch into the dragons because that is a very complicated story that will be expanded further when we talk about the Duergon. But suffice to say that that the dragons are primordial and ludicrously powerful. They were beyond godlike, but chose to reduce themselves to be able to experience life and the glory of this balanced creation. They chose to forego their insane power and reduce themselves to be able to experience it directly. The Spires knew nothing of this. They just knew there was another intelligent species with which they would have to share a planet. They didn't want to. So a war started, which initially went well for the Spires, until the Elder Dragons woke up and they're like, what is going on precisely? And the end result is that the Spire Society, over the course of this war, split. I shouldn't say Spire. The Exile Society split into three: the Weavers, who chose to adapt to the planet, but also adapt the planet to themselves. So they've got this creepy terraforming alien edge to them. They're not your happy-go-lucky wood elves. You have the Quiet, who chose to follow their own path and turn their back on life binding and anything that came from it. And finally, you have the Spires, the most ambitious and driven of them all, who refused to give the reins of power, even though the majority of their population abandoned them. And so they grabbed life binding and perverted it into the science of biomancy. And biomancy basically allowed them to recreate their population from scratch, growing it from specific vats and modifying life to suit their purposes. So when you see a Spire army, what you're looking at is clones and drones created to fight on behalf of their masters, who will never risk themselves on a battlefield, but will rather send out their menial shock troops to fight and die as they will. The few authentic Spire individuals that you might see will most often be using Avatara projections, in which they project themselves into a hollow or empty biosuit, and basically play on the battlefield because there is no risk to themselves. So what you have is a faction of leaders and throwaway troops beneath them, all of which can be expended for the benefit of the leaders. As I mentioned that we like the historicity, for the Spires we chose to model them on the East India Trading Company, and so it creates this very interesting power dynamic between the sovereign, who's the leader of the Spire, and the directory, let's call it directorate. They are, think of it as the board of governors or the board of trustees of the Spire Society. And so it technically belongs to the owner, but he's got to contend with the will of his board. And there's these really, really interesting power plays and intense politicking that goes on between them. And all of this informs the armies and how they fight and how they play. You have the sovereign lineages that usually use very high quality troops, crafted from the very best strands and elevated to absolute biological perfection. You have the directorate that tend to have more out there forces, strange monsters, powerful incarnates, creatures created for the purpose of mayhem on the battlefield. And finally, you have the Underspire, and the Underspire are sort of the dregs of Spire Society. They're the guys that get the work done, the guys that tend to the spawning vats, the guys that spawn drone after drone and clone after clone, and they are the numberless hordes in battle. And you'll see that their special army rules tend to encourage trading your forces up, using your biomancy and your ferromancy to selectively buff your troops and allow them to trade up, so that at the end you are always one above your opponent. So it's an army of deep strategic and tactical play, and it's an army full of tricks. So the spires are the first of what we call the elder races. The second one is the Duerhom. The Duerhom are our Tolkien dwarf analog. And when you think of the Tolkien dwarves, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, greedy creatures dug too deep, woke the Balrog, and are now in perpetual decline. The Duerhom were slightly different. They were created when the dragons defeated the spires. They claimed from them one prize, and that was biomancy. And the dragons then used the biomancy to create the perfect servitor race, who would give them all the toys that they themselves didn't have, didn't need, but didn't know they wanted until they saw the spires have them. So the dragons created the dwarves to craft for them their rooks, to craft for them all these beautiful treasures that they had seen the spires have and that they coveted. And for millennia this worked. The problem is that the dragons gave the dwarves an almost perfect memory that would transcend generations, so that they didn't have to teach each subsequent generation, because at heart they are ancient immortal beings that couldn't really be bothered to micromanage. The problem with that is that the grievances with their masters started piling up. And so at some point, a number of dwarves get very angry, try to rebel against the dragons, only to find out that they've got this terror and awe of their creators, like coded into their very DNA. They're very easily defeated, and they're exiled to the depths and the most horrible mines that the dragons have, to mine them in the most dangerous of environments for the most precious of materials, and pretty much forgotten about, which proves to be a costly mistake, because those same dwarves dig so deep and so angrily that they actually manage to stumble upon the prison of war. War is one of the four horsemen, and it's an incarnate soul of one of the three primordials. So our world has balance, creation, and destruction. And we live in an age of balance because both destruction and creation have been neutralized. And in the ensuing limbo and in the ensuing balance was born. The dwarves came upon one of destruction's sort of incarnate souls that the dragons of old had hidden away, and it's part of how they had bound destruction itself. And basically they thought, this is a great idea, we're going to set this guy free and he's going to help us against the dragons. And then a few of them thought, you know, we shouldn't have it fight the dragons, we should fight the dragons ourselves with its power. So what they did was they tapped into the primordial prison of war and stole its essence. And that was the day that the dwarves evolved into the Duerhom. The Duerhom are physically larger, sturdier, taller than your dwarf, not as tall as a human being, but tapping into the elemental primordial nature of the prison infused all Duerhom with earth and fire, primordial earth and fire. So the Duerhom are actually a deeply, deeply sorcerous and magical race. Every Duerhom manifests to a greater or lesser degree the gifts of earth and fire. That's why they're so strong, they're so resilient, they're resistant to heat. They can metabolize just about anything. But they also seem to have inherited some of the instability from war. And as a result, they're incredibly warlike. Their revolution against the dragons basically led to the annihilation of the draconic race and the breaking of the world. And once they had defeated literally everything that could stand in their path, they started fighting each other. Because here's the thing with having a perfect memory. Two individuals can have seen the same event from a different point of view and experience that event completely differently. But if you're absolutely convinced that you are right, because your memory is perfect and it tells you what happened, it's going to make it very difficult to agree with somebody who lived that from another point of view and saw it differently. And what normally would have been points of difference that could be argued around. In the case of the Duerom, with their incredibly precise memory and their warlike nature, the result is basically civil war in unprecedented proportions. So it's not so much that the Duerom are a race in decline as they are probably one of the most terrifying forces on Ia, but thankfully turn against each other as often as they turn against others. Their army is deceptively complex to use, and I use the word deceptively because they have very powerful defense and morale statistics. They're able to deal a lot of damage. They move a little bit slower than most armies, not significantly slower, a little bit. Heavily magical, heavily into artillery fire, sorcery, and aggressive, but they pay for all of this. So you tend to have a few fewer troops on the battlefield, so you have to be very selective with your engagements and how you choose to use the exceptional resources that each one of your soldiers is. So the next faction are the Nords. The easiest way to think of the Nords is they're post-apocalyptic Vikings. They worshipped their gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, and everything was going great until the Surtr, the father of the fire giants, decided to make war on Yggdrasil and the land of the gods and the land of the Nords. And Loki, for some unknown reason, sided with Surtr and slew Heimdall. Right? This is very generic stuff until now. With Heimdall dead, the Einherjar, right, the undying army of the gods, couldn't be summoned. And as a result, Surtur and his legions were able to overwhelm the gods, break Yggdrasil, and bring about Fimbulwinter, the end of times, when the Jotnar came down and enslaved humanity. This is, an interesting enough riff on Norse mythology, but what I believe makes it interesting is that everything I just mentioned has a different point of view. And that point of view is as follows. The Aesir and the Vanir that the Norse followed were in fact weavers and spires who, in the only instance of cooperation that there is in the planet, got together and created Yggdrasil, which was a world tree, a tree large enough to tower over mountains, that housed the population of these two species, or of this one species and two different cultures, that in their unity managed to accomplish way more than either could on their own. Unfortunately, their hubris and their power threatened Haslia, the god of mankind, who they called Surtr, and Haslia sent his legions forth to basically burn down Yggdrasil. Loki, for reasons known only to himself, betrayed the gods and slew Heimdall before he could wake up the legion of Einherjar. And this is where things get interesting. The Einherjar are actually Norse who were, as mythology says, picked from the battlefield by Valkyries. Guess what? Valkyries were messengers of the gods, so they were these weaver/spire hybrids. They were the greatest warriors of mankind, were elevated with spire and weaver technology into absolutely formidable combat machines that would be held in stasis for a moment of need. This moment never came. The gods were destroyed, the Norse people scattered, and the giants descended from their mountain fastnesses and dominated mankind throughout the Fimbulwinter. The Fimbulwinter, the aforementioned fall that we brought up a little while ago, literally caused by when the humans dragged Haslia from the heavens and slammed him into the earth, causing basically a minor extinction level event that threatened to wipe out humanity. Here's the interesting thing. Several hundred years later, as the systems of the now burnt up Yggdrasil finally give up the ghost, the Einherjar wake up to find their gods dead, their people broken, and the giants ruling everything. And this was an army that scared a god. So yeah, they took it out on the poor giants. And effectively you have these superhuman entities, a fraction only of whom who woke up, pushed back the giants, broke them, enslaved them, and proceeded to try to recreate their society in the lands of Mannheim, in the frozen north, an incredibly inhospitable and difficult environment. The problem is that when the Aesir and the Vanir, when the Norse gods created the Einherjar, they weren't really planning on them surviving very long. And they had certainly not planned for what would happen when the Einherjar had children, right? And this is what happened. Slowly, the Einherjar intermarried with the Norse population, and their strange biology was transferred onto their children in much lesser form, obviously, than the power they themselves had. But, their genes were passed into the local human population. And more interestingly, because the evolution process of an Einherjar was deeply subconscious, a lot of them slowly started losing themselves into their power and their identity. So what you essentially have is in Nord society is a society that realizes that they can't ignore their monstrous cousins, and they need to harness their power to dominate the incredibly hostile environment they're in. And so you'll find a society that has Jotnar that still hold to the oaths that their defeated forefathers swore. You will find trolls who are cousins. You will find Ugur who are treated both with honor, but also a certain amount of, it's a complex relationship with the Ugur. All of these in an army that has only recently started understanding that the invaders from the south and Surtr and the fire giants were in fact the southerners and their descendants who killed their gods. So there's a number of sort of vengeful raids being launched, and that is the heart of the Nord identity. They are raider armies. It's very common to look at the Nords immediately and say, oh, this is a deeply brawling army that can go toe-to-toe with anybody. Not quite. They are a raiding force. You can create an army that goes toe-to-toe when you focus exclusively on their exalted troops, right? These guys that are slightly more than mortal because of the Einherjar blood running through their veins. But if you're running mortal remnants or the blooded, who are the ones that can't really control the blood of their forefathers, so if you're thinking trolls, Ugurs, werewolves, these are raiding troops, right? You depend on striking first, striking hard, and preventing your opponent from punching you. Because I don't want to call them a glass cannon, but they're close to a glass cannon. Let's call them a ceramic hammer. It's an army that needs finesse, but they are very rewarding to play because exactly you've got that story of the raiders and in a way, the underdogs and the wronged ones avenging themselves upon a world that basically hurt them and then moved on. Wadrun. Orcs and dinosaurs. Next. No, seriously, if that's not enough to sell you on the faction, I don't know what is. It's orcs and dinosaurs. That sums them up. Okay, no, they're looking at me weird. I have to explain a little bit more. Do you really need more than orcs and dinosaurs, though? Fine. The Wadrun are the youngest race. They were created by the Spires, who got tired of growing armies and wanted to breed them instead. As usual, it didn't work out. You'll notice this theme with the Spires. And the Wadrun broke out. They originally worshipped 4 gods. Conveniently, those 4 gods happen to also be the horsemen. So they worshipped war, death, famine, and conquest. Oddly enough, during the liberation of the Wadrun, famine, war, and death were somehow killed. But conquest survived. And she took control of the Wadrun race and has been trying to elevate them beyond their violent origins since. They're the youngest race on Ea, and there's a certain innocence about them that I particularly like. They were crafted to be soldiers, but they're trying to forge their own destiny, create their own culture, make a place for themselves, while at the same time saddled with bodies literally bred for war that burn so many calories that their biggest limiting factor is the ability to sustain their own population. Now, obviously, this limits your numbers, but each individual is incredibly powerful, in line with your traditional, let's call it orc physiology, generic orc physiology. You're going to see the tribes, right? They are your generic, standard tribal Wadrun who labor and try to thrive in the environments that they've been allowed. You have the cults, who are the three, let's call them subservient cults of death, famine, and war, that each of them, though, has been changed in an attempt to make them something positive, not just something destructive, right? A little bit of destruction, a little bit of creation to make something balanced. So war, for example, is associated with the element of earth, and he is also the blacksmith and the builder. Death is associated with blood or water, and she is the slayer, but she's also the healer, the midwife. And finally, you have famine, who is, whose aspect of hunger is harnessed by a hunger for learning and a hunger for education and history and a passion for the people. So they're the bards, the poets, and the prophets of their civilization. And finally, you have the scions of Conquest, who are the seers, the visionaries, and the leaders. Notice a slight imbalance there, but we don't talk about that. It's taboo. And they have a living goddess breathing down their necks. So the entire society of the Wadrun is this sort of young people under the yoke of a goddess who's trying to lead them in the same direction, but probably forcing them a little bit too hard. And their evolution as a people into an uncertain future. Yeah, if that and Orcs and Dinosaurs doesn't do it, I give up, seriously. So the Old Dominion. Remember when I told you that we had the fall of the Roman Empire and how it marked pretty much the world a second time? Because the first one was the Duorum, blowing everything up, the breaking of the world. But the second major event was the fall. So the Dominion was the empire that fell. And it wasn't so much the Dominion that fell as it was the Dominion that literally reached into the heavens, yanked their own god, and sort of brought him down. The problem is that you can't kill an immortal. You can wound him onto dying, but he will never die. So when death reached out and offered him a deal, he took it. And what was born of that unholy fusion is undeath, and it's no good. So the Old Dominion is basically the reanimated remains of Haslia's old worshippers, who were resurrected by their own god in vengeance for his destruction. The story gets a lot more complicated and involved in that, so it's beyond the scope. But the interesting thing about the Old Dominion is that they're not your traditional undead. It's not stab a guy in an alley, do some mumbo jumbo, and you resurrect his corpse and you've got one more trooper. I never understood in other factions how the undead are not invincible if every casualty is one more troop. In this world, you have to have been a believer of Haslia for his power to be able to enter you. That means that he has a finite number of resources. And the remnants of his priesthood are very, very thorough in excavating all of the old necropolises, the mausoleums, the charnel pits, every single aspect of the Dominion itself, to uncover the bodies of his fighters and his soldiers so that they can reanimate them to basically enforce Haslia's will. Now, the interesting thing is, through a lot of heroic self-sacrifice and things that I have to summarize, Haslia himself is not in control of the Old Dominion. The Anointed are, and the Anointed are inheritors of Haslia's power, but not necessarily his will. So, while a lot of them are freakish undead monstrosities, others don't have such simple agendas. So it creates a slightly more layered and deep approach to the undead, which I always found enticing Oh, and finally, it should be fairly evident, but you will see a strong Byzantine, Roman, and classical heritage to the forces of the Old Dominion. And that's because we wanted, much like the fall represented the fall of the Roman Empire, we wanted the Old Dominion to be the Roman Empire, both the Eastern and the Western. So the Old Dominion has an interesting play style, which is every time a trooper is destroyed, his power or his essence is absorbed by his fellows. So in the beginning, the army is actually quite weak, but as more and more of your troops die and their neighbors absorb more and more power, they start remembering more, they start operating more efficiently, they start coming closer to what they used to be once upon a time, with all the advantages of being unseeing, unfeeling, and automata. But their memories are kindled, their reflexes are slightly faster, they can manifest their abilities slightly easier, and the army gets stronger and stronger the more of them that you kill. So eventually it becomes a question of scoring enough before they become an unstoppable juggernaut, or landing such a heavy blow that the few troops that remain are not enough to take you out, whatever their current power level are. Because if you go for a straight war of attrition, the Old Dominion are going to win. So, the city-states. Again, I'm going to try to summarize them quickly and then give you a little bit of background. Steampunk classical Greece. So the origin of the city-states is actually very simple. They're the diaspora of the Old Dominion. There was an individual who saw what was happening. There were in fact two individuals who saw what was happening to Haslia and the growing madness. And each of them saw a different path onto how to save mankind from this god gone mad. One of them said, we'll kill the god. The other said, we will escape the god. The city-states are the direct results of the effort of the second. As the empire disintegrated under the weight of the mad orders of a crazy god, this architect started secreting away resources and creating colonies in a faraway land and saving as much of the knowledge of the dominion as he could in order to safeguard the future of mankind. Now the problem is he had an ambitious plan. He wanted to create a perfect society based on, if any of you have read Plato's Republic, you know, you have the philosopher king, you have the guardians around him, you have the educators, right? And he had this beautiful society laid out in his mind, but he knew that he wouldn't live long enough to be able to form this among his people. But he also knew that, having unlocked the secrets of divinity, that if he became a god, he would become corrupted eventually. So his logic was, I won't become one god, I will become a semi-divine council. I will split myself into 7 parts. And each of these parts will rule the city together. And if any one of them gets corrupted, I can replace it. And so he did that. He used knowledge that, we're not going to go into the details, but he traded with certain people that, you know, have the ability to create bodies, we mentioned before, the spires, created perfect copies of himself, downloaded his brain into each copy, and put that in these weird-ass tanks, and used divine energy to keep those tanks and those bodies and those consciousnesses alive and communing. And that's how the first city-state was born, and it is run by basically the Scholai, this strange council of weird demi-human entities. This was a great success, so he chose to copy it, except he had lost access to the cloning facilities, so he went for the next best choice, which was other people, acquired generally from, you know, criminals and such. The problem is that the transference process wasn't as good, so those councils weren't as effective as the original. So you have a number of things that happen. Some city-states, the copy was quite good, so it's still in power today. Quirky, weird, going in strange directions, but working. Other city-states, the council collapsed entirely, the people rose up and have taken over it, and there are these demagogues, sort of democratic city-states or tyrannical city-states, where basically whatever the leader says or whatever the people say goes. And the last is, having unlocked the secrets of divinity, Platon, the architect of the city-states, had decided that each city-state would have a small patron god, but it wasn't a danger because that patron god would be imprisoned from his very birth, his power siphoned to feed the industry, his very blood taken from his veins, and the blood of gods is essentially the phlogiston, the material upon which all city-states, science, and sorcery is based on. But what happened is, as the scholae broke down, some of these gods broke free and took over their own city-states. And needless to say, they're not very friendly to the other city-states. So what you end up having is this weirdly technological, demagogue, and religious city-states continuously fighting each other. All of them have a certain degree of technical expertise inherited from the Old Dominion. Weird developments of we call it alchemy, a magic and science blended together through the power of divinity. So what they do is strange, and their magic itself is not your traditional magic. What they seek to do is rather override reality within a region, override the laws of physics within a region, by calling on the sort of the power of divinity. Their troops are usually, you'll see the classical troops. We focus a little bit more on the Hellenistic age rather than the classical Greece to give you a little bit more variety. So you're going to have the hoplites. So you have the hoplites, who are your traditional hoplites. You have the phalangites, who are the guys with the big long pikes. You have the thorakites, who are a lighter version of them, that didn't really use spears. It was mostly shields and swords. You're going to have the agima, that were based on Alexander's own chosen troops. You're also going to have minotaurs, satyri, and seleni. Troops, I can't get into this too much, but they're effectively demi-human troops gifted to the Old Dominion by the Spires in an attempt to make the Old Dominion depend too much on those troops and eventually issue a plague that would kill them all, except that the Old Dominion imploded before that kill switch could be used. So now there's these leftover bread, as they're called, and they're the mythological species. So the city-states obviously work well around their phalanxes. They also have allied to the Titans, who are cousins to the Jotnar, that have chosen to shelter and protect mankind rather than ignore it or oppose it. You have an army with very strong anvil hammers, but relatively limited mobility, with chariots, with giants, with phalanxes, and mythological troop. I mean, what is there not to like? So remember how I told you that the fall is pretty important? Well, the 100 Kingdoms are the sort of the masses of refugees that fled. The city-states are the organized refugees that fled. The sorcerer kings, they are the last refugees. They're the guys that fled literally as the god was falling down on their head, because these are the guys that killed their god. The 4 sorcerer kings are the 4 humans that enacted the ritual that killed Haslia, or almost killed Haslia. Big difference. Thanos had it right. Go for the head. They didn't, and they paid for it. So literally you have these incredibly powerful sorcerers that cast this ritual. They're like, yes, we've won. And then they see their god's counterstroke descending on them from the heavens and go, oh no. They're still empowered by the ritual. So literally what they do is they grab what population they have. They use the remnant magic of the ritual and literally start raising a chain of islands to help the population of Capitas, of the main city of the Old Dominion, to help them flee. And they go as far deep as they can until they can really go no further along this chain of volcanic islands that they raised. And then they literally raise an entire continent from the seabed. and turn it into their new land, using their insane elemental prowess to make it hospitable. But that obviously is the work of generations. And the Sorcerer Kings themselves, the original four, the reason they became so powerful is because they bound themselves to the... Much like we have the incarnate souls of destruction, we have the incarnate soul of creation and conquest. Balance also has incarnate souls, and those are the four elements. And each of these bound themselves to the ultimate manifestation of those elements. And that's why they can channel so much power. But they also inherited a certain amount of responsibilities that curtail their power to a certain degree. So, the Sorcerer Kings, deeply magical army. They use both mortal and primordial forces from the domains themselves. So you'll see Ifrit, you will see Jinn, you will see ghouls, you will see Rakshasas, you will see animated elephants, and at the same time you will see disciplined soldiery, you will see fantastic archers. They're an elite army, they're a very complex army, not for beginners, but a fantastic challenge and a very powerful force for those who learn to master them. And then you have our upcoming faction, the Yoroni. How to summarize the Yoroni? Japanese mythology come to life. The Yoroni are the foot troops of primordial destruction that were imprisoned by the dragons within the elemental domains of balance, in the very bowels of the elemental domains of balance, knowing that in time they would be basically ground down into raw power that balance could use to empower itself. What they couldn't have expected is how that much exposure to such concentrated element and elemental balance would affect the spirits themselves, or how the prayers of a, let's call it, proto-Japanese human faction that worshipped the five elements as ideals would basically create a pathway for these demons to evolve past their origin, right, and their destructive origin into a more enlightened and ascended people. So they have climbed these incredible depths from the elemental hell all the way to the prime material, following the path and the teachings of these mortals whose ideas formed the path that they are now climbing. They are at heart a very elite army, so much so that they can have the smallest units in the game going down to 2 stands, and they can make a use of mixed units. So they can have different troops all in one unit, which allows you to customize your force tremendously. And unlike other factions, they don't use your traditional command stack. Any one of their cards can activate any unit, but if you use the right card on the right unit, that empowers that unit even further. So they're an army that is very easy to learn to play with because of the quality of their troops and the ease of their command stack. But to get the full power out of them, you're going to have to learn to master the command stack. Sacrifice a portion of your flexibility to be able to give them power by activating the right cards and the right regiments at the right time. I look forward to seeing what you guys can do with them.